Hi guys, welcome to welcome to this evening's webinar entitled Britain and Palestine, 104 years of ramifications of Balfour, hosted by the Palestinian Return Center. During today's webinar, we hope the British government have begun the erosion of Palestinian human rights, and they're still that are still being going on today. So before I introduce our speakers today, I'm going to introduce the My Return campaign. It is a popular voluntary initiative launched by the London-based Palestinian Return Center, PCR partners. The campaign was first launched in Jordan in cooperation with the committee. It's in a petition that calls for Parliament and reaffirms the Palestinian right of return. The campaign seeks to turn such an inalienable right into an international cause. The campaign seeks to garner the largest possible number of signatures on a petition confirming Palestinian refugees' devotion to their right of return. The petition clearly states that it rejects the US deal of the century and any other initiative undermining Palestinian internationally guaranteed rights. Israel and US have never ceased to undermine such an inalienable Palestinian right by denying the refugee status of occupied Jerusalem and as Israel's capital. The campaign waged by Israel and the US under UNRWA, the US suspension of its funding to Palestinian refugee and the increasing calls to resettle the refugees through seemingly refusing to resettle the refugees to destination other than Palestine in its tactics to reach this goal. The right of return will never be negotiated away or used as a bargaining chip. The campaign is based on individual signatures on My Return petition through its official website. The petition has already garnered 1 million of signatures. Please sign now. So if you do have any questions you'd like for our speakers, we'll have a time at the end for you to ask. And to introduce our first speaker, we have Leanne Mohammed. She is a British Palestinian born, raised in London, and a current final year student at KCL. She won UK Redbridge Regional Speak Out Challenge in May 2016 after giving an impressive performance to an enthusiastic applause. Leanne delivered a speech entitled Birds Not Bombs, based on her country and her passion, Palestine, in which she was calling for peace and freedom, and to an end of the injustices to Palestinians, that the Palestinians are facing, especially Palestinian children. Her speech called for freedom, justice, and peace, but after she was faced with a barrage of hatred and abusive comments, as well as attempts to silence her. Since then, Leanne has carried on to be a leading activist in her fight, in the fight for human rights, speaking and appearing at many popular universities and conferences. She has even spoken in Parliament, has been recognised and spoken spoken internationally. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you to everyone else tuning into this very important discussion tonight. It's truly an honour to be speaking alongside Dr. Ghada and Lowkey tonight, And thank you to the Palestinian Return Centre and the organisers behind the scenes as well. First of all, apologies for my voice sounding like this. I am quite ill, but regardless, it's okay. The cause always comes first. So to introduce myself, my name is Leanne Mohammed, and I am a British Palestinian student activist based in London. Of course, no doubt, today is a day that I'd say weighs heavy on every Palestinian's heart, and simply because it is the reason why we are still resisting till this very day, why we are still fighting for freedom and our right of return. And the consequences of this day, 104 years ago, are still living with us today. And who would have thought that one letter could play such a huge part in the erosion of our Palestinian human rights that are still being eroded to this day? Now, for us Palestinians, the Balfour Declaration is nothing to celebrate, but it is an act of betrayal by Britain and a reminder of the continuous reality of the dispossession, oppression, and injustice that the Palestinian people continue to endure. Today, we mark 104 years since the inception of the Balfour Declaration, a colonial document that paved the way for the creation of the settler colonial state of Israel and the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. But as a British Palestinian living in Britain, I always question this to myself on this day, which I refer to as the most disastrous day in Palestinian history, which was the 2nd of November 1917. And it's always the same questions. What right did Britain have to give away my homeland? Why do they think it's okay to simply just organise people's lives like that? And why do people still question the existence of Palestine when it's pretty clear from the Balfour Declaration that it existed and it was stolen from its owners? Now, my homeland was not Balfour to so casually grant to someone else. Britain had no right to destroy lives, completely disregarding the basic human rights and aspirations of the Palestinian people, destabilising an entire region and leading to the longest military occupation in recent history. So, Balfour was a historic promise by Britain to hand over lands that did not own, laying out the foundation of the settler colonial state of Israel. And as late British author and journalist Arthur Koestler summed it up, this was one nation promising to another nation the country of a third nation. From the ones who don't deserve, from the ones who don't own to the ones who don't deserve. And I thank PRC for hosting this discussion today because it's so important for everyone to learn about the significance of Balfour's fateful declaration and Britain's central role in our Palestinian struggle, our ongoing struggle. This was one promise 104 years ago, yet it resulted in hundreds of thousands of Palestinians falling victim to the greed of colonialism, expansion, and ethnic cleansing as a result of the Balfour Declaration. So Balfour, what I want you to know is, Balfour was not just a declaration, but it's a process that paved the way to today's ongoing Palestinian tragedy, dating from Balfour's pledge 104 years ago, yet imposing itself upon almost every aspect of Palestine's present today. Britain has played a major role in the tragedy which befell the Palestinian people, and today, Israel's colonization of Palestinian lands continues. Palestinian refugees remain dispossessed, and millions of Palestinians are displaced. All this was in order to create the settler colony of Israel. And what's worse is that Britain, Israel, and its supporters instead mark this day as a joyous celebration, celebrating the historical trauma of Palestinians and British imperial crimes, a certainly dark chapter of Britain's colonial history. 104 years of British responsibility has passed, and the British government are yet to possess the moral courage to apologise and take on responsibility of their role in the ongoing predicament of the Palestinians, also failing to acknowledge its own complicity. But nevertheless, the way I look at it now is that even if they were to miraculously apologise and take on responsibility, this won't come close to compensating decades of the pain and suffering that our Palestinian families have endured and are still enduring till this very day. Now, not only did Britain abandon Palestinians to face the terror of Zionism in 1948, but it continues to befriend the colonial state that oppresses them. And this is also a reminder that the Zionist movement was only able to advance its goal of establishing a Jewish state in Palestine with the support of a Western colonial power. And today, Israel is only able to persist in systematic violations of international law because of the backing, again, of powerful Western allies, especially, of course, from the United States. and Palestinians so remain victims of the shameful support of Western governments, from the UK Balfour Declaration to the US Embassy move to Jerusalem. Victims of apartheid, ethnic cleansing, racism, demolition, displacement, and dehumanization as a result of Balfour. But again, my homeland was not Balfour's to so casually grant to someone else. And my displaced Palestinian family and I are a living consequence of the Balfour Declaration 104 years later. And today, as Israel continues its violent regime of ethnic cleansing and apartheid, it is now more vital than ever that we continue to stand together and organize for Palestine. Remember, our solidarity movement is not a trend, but it's a continuous fight until justice prevails. Our work hasn't stopped, and we must continue our path of resistance, supporting the oppressed and never the oppressors. Now, no matter what they do, no matter who goes against us, no matter how much they try to erase us in their efforts, Palestine will always exist so as long as we continue to resist. And it is so important that we continue to have discussions like this. So important that we continue boycotting, protesting, and educating. And so important that we unapologetically continue to speak out until we have justice. So we must continue to put pressure on our government to make it clear that we will not allow racism, occupation, and apartheid to go unchallenged, simply because we do not stand for the normalization of colonialism, human rights abuses, and violations of international human rights law. Now, not only does the UK not apologise 104 years later, but instead celebrate the Balfour Declaration, they are also one of Israel's biggest arms suppliers. And to that, we say shame, because the UK is systematically complicit in our Palestinian suffering, and this complicity must come to an end. So our resistance now is not a choice, but it's an obligation, because none of us are free until all of us are free. And our generation, I believe, truly has the power to dismantle the system of oppression. The tide is truly turning, and the fight for justice is now. And so we need every single one of you watching right now to join us, because as long as the colonization continues, then so will our global resistance. And so I want to end on the words of Mohamad al-Kurd from Sheikh Jarrah. They are betting on our exhaustion. I am betting on our stubbornness. Don't tire, don't bore. Don't stop standing up for Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leanne. Like I said before, we'll ask any questions at the end. So to introduce our next speaker, we have Lowkey, who is a British-born Iraqi rapper, activist, and historian, who has been a very vocal advocate for Palestinian rights, including the right of return. The floor is yours.
So I think to begin any discussion about the Balfour Declaration, it is essential to look at three different characters. Number one, of course, Arthur Balfour. This was somebody that in 1905, as Prime Minister, had passed the Aliens Act. The Aliens Act was designed to keep out Jewish victims of Tsarist Russia, where Jewish people were suffering pogroms and all other types of unfreedom. Arthur Balfour at that time was very clear that he did not want a home for Jewish people within the United Kingdom. When we look at the circumstances which came around to form the Balfour Declaration, we know that Britain was anxious about Germany issuing a similar statement. And one of the figures who was working tirelessly in this country to get the British government to pass this statement was Chaim Weizmann. Now, Chaim Weizmann's relationship with the British government was deeply affected by World War I. He was a chemist in Manchester at that time. And because the British could no longer import materials they needed for weaponry from Germany, because of course they were at war with them, despite the fact that they were both ruled by Queen Victoria's grandsons, they found and enlisted Chaim Weizmann into the process of producing acetone for British weaponry. And he was able to develop a method whereby he could turn starch found in potatoes and corn and other things to be turned into acetone and used for weapons. At that time, you had Winston Churchill as the Lord of Admiralty. Balfour later replaced him, and you had Lloyd George as the Minister of Munitions. It was at that time that, because of his success with what they called the Balfour process, the Wiseman process, which was later industrialized in the United States and Canada, that he moved to Kensington, Holland Park, 67 Addison Road, where his second child was born. But that was where he hosted a lot of different British politicians. And so eventually he was able to procure the Balfour Declaration from the British government. Originally, they had put forward the idea that the Balfour Declaration would include the following words: Palestine should be reconstituted as a national home for the Jewish people. Later, thanks to the opposition of the only Jewish member of the British government at that time, Edwin Montagu, it was in fact changed to the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, something the British government supports. And of course, Edwin Montagu, who was derided by Chaim Weizmann and other Zionists at that time as one of the quote-unquote assimilationists, described what he was seeing as the anti-Semitism of the present in Britain. And it was his conviction that this logic that Zionism was walking along, essentially Yusuf al-Kabir, an Iraqi lawyer, later described Zionism of Jewish background, described Zionism as militant archaeology. So essentially, Edwin Montagu identified this militant archaeology as being pushed by anti-Semites in the rest of the world, but also as being something that would pave the way for, in Edwin Montagu's words, citizenship potentially being granted only as a result of a religious test. And of course, we have seen essentially that is what happens in the Israeli state today. So a very prescient statement by Edwin Montagu at that time. And so the key thing about the Balfour Declaration was that it established a creative ambiguity, which was applied by Herbert Samuel as the first High Commissioner of the British Mandate to establish separate institutions for the settler community, referred to in Hebrew as the Yishuv, and the indigenous Palestinian community. And it was that laid the foundations for the apartheid state. So the Balfour Declaration was absolutely essential to that process of separate institutions for two groups of people. But while we do want our young people to know the name Arthur Balfour, we do want our young people to know names like Chaim Weizmann. And it's important that people read his book, Trial and Error, because it gives a real insight into the mechanics and the nuts and bolts behind the Balfour Declaration. We also want young people to know the names like Mohamad Jamjoom, Fuad al-Hijazi, Mahiba Khurshid, Ibrahim Tuqan. We want our young people to know those who resisted. And we must work on creating those mechanisms through which young people can learn about the resistance. Because, of course, Palestinian resistance against Zionism and ethnic cleansing from the 1880s to today is the longest continuous anti-colonial struggle in the world. It represents a universal struggle for justice. And today we exist at a time where Palestinian resistance is defined by the United States, the UK, Israel, and the EU, and perhaps maybe Japan, as terrorism. But those governments, when put together, the United States government ostensibly represents 331 million people. The UK government supposedly represents 66 million people. The Israeli government represents 9 million people. And the EU represents about 446 million people. So that is approximately governments which represent 861 million people defining Palestinian resistance as terrorism. But what about the rest of the world? Well, Switzerland doesn't define the main Palestinian resistance organizations as terrorist organizations. The Swiss government represents 8.5 million people. Pakistan Their government represents 223 million people, and it does not define the main Palestinian resistant organizations as terrorist organizations. Turkey, which represents 82 million people, does not define and designate these groups as terrorist organizations. The Chinese government, which represents 1.4 billion people, the Russian government, which represents 144 million people, the Iranian government, which represents 82 million people, the Venezuelan government, which represents 28 million people. It's well over 1 billion people in the world are represented by governments who do not define Palestinian resistance as terrorism. We are on the side of the majority of the world. When we look at even UN General Assembly resolutions, you see at least two which explicitly reference the Palestinians as having the right to liberate themselves through armed struggle as an occupied people. Today, we see not only a war in the rest of the world against that sacred right to resist and to liberate themselves, Palestinians to liberate themselves from Israeli occupation and colonization, but we also see a war against BDS. It's important to remember that today in this country, on the anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, we have seen Palestine Action shut down Elbit Systems, the biggest Israeli arms company, factory in Bristol, and also have an action against the landlord for Elbit Systems on the same day. This is a form of community enforced BDS. But when people attack our right to respond to Palestinian civil society and engage in BDS, they say, why do you exceptionalize Israel? There's all types of other human rights abusers in the world. Well, the answer must be absolutely clear. We do not exceptionalize Israel. Israel is exceptionalized by the international community. Article 11 of UN Resolution 194 makes very clear that the Palestinians have the right to return. 1 in 3 refugees in the world today are Palestinian. And in fact, preventing Palestinians from returning to their homes is prohibited under the Apartheid Convention and the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Yet what did we see on the Great March of Return? We saw IDF, Israeli occupying forces, snipers targeting the knees of Palestinians, shooting people like Razan Najjar, a nurse clearly identified as medical personnel, shooting Yasser Murtaja in his chest, despite the fact he had the word press written across it. We also know it's illegal under international law to acquire land by force, according to the United Nations Charter. It's illegal to colonize occupied land and to transfer non-indigenous populations to that land. That is a violation of Article 49, paragraph 6 of the 4th Geneva Convention. Israel violates the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child by arresting 500 to 700 Palestinian children every single year, some of them as young as 12. The most common charge that they get is stone throwing, for which Israeli military courts can give a maximum sentence of 20 years. Israel has a formal system of legalized discrimination against Palestinians. Now that fits the official UN definition of apartheid, which of course is considered to be a crime against humanity, has a dual legal system for different groups of people based on their identity. Of course, we know it was in 2004 that the International Court of Justice ruled that the wall in the West Bank is illegal and should be dismantled. Well, that was 17 years ago. And where are we today? We also know that the targeting of civilians is a crime explicitly defined by the Geneva Conventions, yet we have seen Israel do it again and again. Collective punishment is also illegal and is clear from Article 33 of the Geneva Conventions. We also know that last year, in 2020, there were 17 different UN General Assembly resolutions that criticized Israel. And just so we can get a grasp on how abnormal a level of UN resolutions that is, there were only 6 that criticized countries in the rest of the world. So out of 23 UN resolutions that criticized states, Israel had occupied 17 of those UN resolutions. Israel refuses to define its borders and has invaded every single country it is next to. And it is believed to have carried out assassinations in at least 18 different states, from Italy to Germany to Egypt to Jordan to Brazil to Tunisia to Belgium to Malta to Syria, Iran. Is it punished? No, quite the opposite. Israel receives $10.4 million per day. That's $430,000 per hour. That's $7,000 per minute. That's $120 per second of US taxpayers' money by the US government. In 2020 alone, we know that pro-Israel lobby groups spent over $33 million on funding members of the US Congress. So is it any surprise that on top of that $10.4 million per day that the US gives Israel, US Congress voted to give another $1 billion on top of that, through which Israel will replenish its Iron Dome system by giving the money to US arms company Raytheon and Israeli arms company Rafael. What we see is a major pushback against BDS, and the instrument through which Israel is doing this, most invisibly, I would say, is through quote-unquote civil society. We have seen Israel criminalize several key Palestinian civil society groups. Well, what kind of civil society is the one that Israel wants the rest of the world to have? A perfect example is an organization by the name of One Voice. Now, I and several others have been investigating this organization since May. In May, we saw an unprecedented uprising by British schoolchildren against Zionist colonization in Palestine. Well, what happened? The emotionally pro-Israel friend of the Israel Friends of the Conservative Friends of Israel, Gavin Williamson, wrote a letter to every head teacher in the country saying that these head teachers should not only work with the Community Security Trust, who I will get to later, but should also work with Solutions Not Sides. Now, Solutions Not Sides is a program of an organization called One Voice. Well, in my investigation of who One Voice is, I found that at least 28 employees of One Voice used to serve in the Israeli occupying forces. I found 4 employees of One Voice who simultaneously worked for the Israeli government. One Voice as an organization also shares funders with the Friends of the IDF, illegal settler colonies in the West Bank, and the Conservative Party. As an organization, One Voice was founded in 2002 by Daniel Lubetsky. Daniel Lubetsky has described his childhood as very Zionistic and has asserted very clearly that he has been fighting BDS before people even know that BDS existed. And he claims that One Voice is the best tool to undermine BDS. He not only founded One Voice, but he's also a director of the Anti-Defamation League, another key tool in Israel's arsenal for squashing BDS across the world. Now, even the FBI in internal memos have questioned whether the Anti-Defamation League violates the US laws on the registration of foreign agents, and has said it is incredible to assume that the ADL is not furnished to an official of the Israeli government. We could go on a lot longer on One Voice, but their board in the past has of course guested the former deputy director of Israeli military intelligence, Danny Rothschild, who absconded from the United Kingdom in 2011 in fear of arrest for war crimes following a warning from the Israeli embassy. It has, of course, hosted a plethora, a panoply of other Israeli war criminals. You even had Roe Newman working for One Voice as head of communications at the same time as being head of communications for the Israeli Minister of Justice and suspected war criminal Livni. When you look at where the money comes from for this organization, One Voice, you have the Righteous Persons Foundation, which also funds the ADL, the Jerusalem Foundation, which builds settlements in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan, which is led by Steven Spielberg. You also, of course, have funding coming in from the Crown family, from the Piers Foundation, from the Cat Atkin Puss Willow Charitable Trust, which also funds the Board of Deputies, an organization which put in its own 2020 trustees report that it has a close working relationship with the Israeli embassy. What we're talking about is proxies of the Israeli government operating in British society as if they are uninterested neutral parties. They are not. There's other organizations that are being put forward to squash BDS, particularly targeting the Muslim community. Forward Thinking is another perfect example. Oliver McTernan has stated publicly that his organization was set up with the help of Amos Giora. Amos Giora is the highest legal opinion within the Israeli occupation forces. He is the person who signs off on strikes to schools that have children in them with the claim that he can legally argue that these strikes were legitimate. Forward Thinking is established as targeting Muslim organizations in order to soften them and bring them around to the idea of peace through dialogue and negotiation. And the reality is this is an asymmetrical question of military and political power. The reason Palestinians don't have rights is not because they haven't sat down and felt the pain of Israelis. The reason they don't have rights is because Israel is killing them and imposing its will upon them. Now, what the rest of us have to do is support the Palestinians in their fight. The Community Security Trust is another organization which functions to crush BDS in the name of fighting racism. Who founded the Community Security Trust? Gerald Ronson. Who is Gerald Ronson? He is a major funder of Benjamin Netanyahu's campaigns in Israel. Anthony Lerman, who used to work with the Community Security Trust, in fact, asserted that some of its employees and volunteers are trained by Israel's external intelligence services. These organizations function to neutralize our ability to support the Palestinian people in their struggle. It is a permanent war. We must be absolutely clear about what it is we are facing, and we must be willing to take direct action to shut down their factories, because there are billions of people around the world who stand with us in this mission.
Thank you, Lowkey, very much. We've got our next speaker coming up. We've got Dr. Ghada Karmi, who is a Palestinian doctor, academic, and author. She writes frequently on Palestinian issues in The Guardian, the Nation, and Journal of Palestinian Studies. She is a fellow and lecturer at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at University of Exeter. Her many publications include her acclaimed memoir, In Search of Fatima, talking about her family's expulsion from Palestine to Britain in 1948. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can I just quickly correct something you said in your introduction? I am a former lecturer and research fellow at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies, University of Exeter. I'm not doing that anymore. Anyway, I have to commend the two previous speakers who, frankly, said it all. So I don't know how much more I can add, but I will do my best. Yes, as you've just heard, of course, November the 2nd today is the 104th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. Now, it's worthwhile repeating that this declaration is a very, very odd document, very odd. Its status is really very unclear. It takes the form of a letter from the British Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, to Lord Rothschild, who was the head of the Zionist community in Britain. It's a letter. And the letter speaks about that the British government would approve of the setting up of something called a Jewish national home in Palestine. And that's all it does. That's actually what it does. Now, if you actually analyze that, you find it's a very, very odd indeed. First of all, this is a letter, so it has no legal status, has no legal standing. Secondly, it's speaking on behalf of the government and saying that they would view with favor or approve of a national home for the Jews in Palestine. Now, Palestine was not ruled by the British at the time, 1917. The First World War hadn't ended, and the British were not in possession of Palestine at that time. So they were expressing a wish, an opinion, if you like, on the establishment of something in a country not under their control. So the first reaction, our reaction should be to the Balfour Declaration. It's a joke. It's silly. It actually is silly if you think about it. The problem, of course, is not in the declaration itself, which I've tried to show is really a very strange little document of very little import on its own merits, as it stands, I mean. But of course, the problem was what was done afterwards by the British once they'd got control of Palestine, what was done to encourage the Zionist project. Now, the previous speakers have obviously made that clear. And our real story, the story really begins with the British nurturing of the Zionist project in Palestine. And that is what led to, ultimately, the creation of Israel. Nobody should have any doubt about that. But for Britain, but for the role it played in the country of Palestine, there would be no Israel today. The Holocaust notwithstanding, all the sufferings of the Jews in the Second World War notwithstanding, there would not have been an Israel. Israel was on the road to being created the moment that the British acquired control of Palestine. Now, it's very interesting to speculate, and many people have done so. Why did the British do it? What was in it for them? We are reminded, as Leanne told us, about the attitude of Arthur Balfour, and many of the British establishment at the time didn't like Jews. So what was this all about, really? And as I say, many people have speculated, what was this? Was there a strategic interest in Palestine in a geopolitical sense, that it was a strategic asset for British imperial designs, imperial policy in the future, and the belief that if they, that's the British government, helped the Zionist movement to establish itself in Palestine and become a state, such a state would be friendly or even subservient to its British creators and would help Britain further its imperialist and strategic plans. Now, there are many adherents to this kind of theory, and we can try and imagine that this made sense. We're talking about an age in which colonialism was the norm. People understood all that. We're also talking about an age in which the Palestinian, the native population of Palestine, were not regarded as a full people in the sense in which the colonial countries would have regarded themselves. These are natives. That means they're not important. That means they're expendable. That means they're invisible. And so, really, you could make an argument for the whole geopolitical strategic argument, given that the colonial attitude at the time was that it didn't matter. You've just got these natives, who cares? So this would explain the British support for Zionism. In addition to that, alternative to that, is of course the Christian Zionist proposal that a number of people in the British government were sympathetic to Zionism on the basis of the Bible, on the basis of a Christian belief that the Jewish people belonged there because of the Bible, because historically there had been a Jewish presence in Palestine. So indeed, many people adhere to this theory, and it could be both. It could be both what I've just talked about, the geopolitical consideration and the Christian Zionism idea. But of course, in the end, it doesn't really matter, does it? What actually motivated Britain doesn't really matter. What matters is the consequences of their nurturing and supporting the Zionist project. And you know very well that the consequences of nurturing the Zionist project, which I prefer to describe it as that rather than the Balfour Declaration, this nurturing of Zionism led, of course, on the one hand, to the creation of Israel, and on the other, the creation of the Palestinian tragedy. I myself am a direct victim of this tragedy. In 1948, my family were forced to flee our home in Jerusalem, and we found refuge in nearby Syria for a short while, and then ended up in England. We were never allowed back, so we were the direct victims of the Zionist project, which was the baby of the Balfour Declaration and of Britain. Today, the consequences live on. We all know that. It created Zionism, created Israel, and Israel created an unending tragedy for the Palestinian people, not only ethnically cleansed, not only dispossessed, but pursued to this day in the 1967 territories by a military occupation, and those of us in exile by the various techniques that the Zionists come up with. The IHRA definition is a very popular one at the moment, but the persecution of Palestinians by the Zionists goes on till today. Now, I want to actually put the focus here on Britain, because of course we know that Israel is responsible for all kinds of crimes. Israel is repressive. Israel is an apartheid state. All that, we know all that. But you see, you've got to keep remembering that the creator of Israel is the country we're talking in now, that we live in now. And I want to tell you a little story in that connection. When I was a child, I would say to my father, now I didn't understand much about any of this, but I gathered there was something to do with Jews and what they'd done to us. That's why we were living in London and so on. And I said to him once, you know, if these Jews were so bad and the British passed this declaration, why are we here? Why are we living here? And particularly, as it so happened, we lived in the Jewish area of London, in Golders Green. And this is one of the ironies of all this. And I said, well, why are we right next to Jews? They're the people who've been very bad to us, I've said, as I understand it. Why are we here? And I always remember my father saying, it's not the fault of the Jews. I don't blame them, he said. I blame the people who helped them. Let me tell you, if you leave your house unlocked one night and thieves invade your house and rob you, whose fault is it? Is it the thief's fault or is it your fault for leaving the door open? That's exactly what Britain did. It left the door open for the Zionists. So I don't know how I'm doing for time, Dania, but I want to now come back to my point, which is that Britain is the architect of this, and Britain must not be let off the hook. It has been let off the hook, and it's quite interesting how the British avoid a discussion of what really happened during the mandate and their own role in it. They have never apologized. They have never offered compensation to the Palestinians, and they appear to have no regret for what they did in encouraging the Zionist project. On the contrary, as my friends, my fellow speakers have pointed out, they celebrate Israel. They are friends of Israel, warm friends of Israel. And in 2017, I don't know how many people will remember, but in 2017, when it was the 100th anniversary, the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, there were celebrations. And we, a group of us, a number of us, wrote to the then British Prime Minister, Theresa May, and demanded an apology on the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. And she replied with quite strongly. She said, far from apologizing, on the contrary, we are happy about Israel. We commend Israel. We have nothing to apologize for. So it seems to me that the work is here in Britain, and the work is to try and make the British authorities accountable for what happened not only in 1917, but in what has been happening ever since that time until today. The behavior of the British establishment has been, as has been pointed out very, very vividly and in great detail, has been to be home, to play host to a number of organizations and groups who work in this country to support a foreign state, Israel. They are given carte blanche, and they are helped, and they are accepted by Britain. At the same time, Israel is a strategic and partner, described nearly as an ally, and the British ties and connections to Israel are close and warm, and you only have to look at what the British Labour Party is doing today to the freedom of people to support or speak about Palestine or to support the Palestinian people. You see that there is a witch hunt using bogus anti-Semitism attacks on people for supporting the Palestinians. That's what the British Labour Party is doing. The Conservatives are warm allies of Israel. So what I really want to end with is to say we need to bring Britain, to call Britain to account for its deadly role in this terrible story. It is really the British kicking off with the Balfour Declaration that has created the tragedy, the enduring tragedy, decades for the Palestinian people, and it has never been called to account. It has never been it has never been demanded of Britain to make any sort of compensation, reparation, even apology to the Palestinian people. And it's very, very heartening and interesting that as I speak to you, there is a Palestinian, a wealthy Palestinian businessman whose name is Munib al-Masri, who is in the process of suing the British government for the Balfour Declaration. This is a really exciting development. And I wish him every success, as I'm sure you do. You might well say to me, well, it's a bit late now, isn't it? Talking about the British, they've already done it. Israel exists, Israel is prospering, and it's got a new patron, the United States. What does it matter if Britain apologizes, doesn't apologize? It won't make any difference, really, to the support that Israel gets. I would say you're very wrong. Not at all. It's very important that we create a precedent. The precedent that you don't do that to an innocent people and get away with it. And if we were able to do that here in Britain and call Britain to, as it should be, as the author, as the original instigator of this project, it would create a precedent. It would make the most enormous difference to the way that the Palestinian story is seen, and would make all those who support the oppressors of the Palestinian think twice before they continue to support Israel. I hope that everybody listening to this will have some kind of resolution, make some kind of determination to take Britain to make Britain pay for what it did. Thank you.
Thank you, Ghada. So if you just stay here, we're going to bring back the rest of the speakers shortly for a Q&A. So a few questions that we're going to ask from the audience, and feel free to just
I guess we could take control of this until Danya comes back. A question I think I would like to ask to Ghada would be, recently I understand that you were targeted by maybe the internal surveillance system of the Labour Party, pushed by, we know that Labour employs a former employee of Unit 8200 in the Israeli occupying forces, Asaf Kaplan, for social listening. We know that Keir Starmer is funded by Trevor Chin, who's one of the arch Israel lobbyists in this country from BICOM. If you could just describe to us what was the kind of targeting that you faced within the Labour Party setting. Perhaps that might be an interesting direction to take the conversation.
Yes, I have been a member of the Labour Party since 1986. I never really expected to become the subject of what is called an investigation on the grounds of anti-Semitism. And this came from Labour headquarters, and I was asked to how I would answer to the accusation that I had said anti-Semitic, had made anti-Semitic statements, etc. You see, the problem with that, of course, was when I looked through these statements, one lot was taken out of an article I wrote 18 months ago, and you'd have thought that somebody might have noticed before now. Anyway, an article I wrote 18 months ago, and then also my Twitter feed, that there were various tweets that I do. All of them relate to Israel. All my comments relate to the state of Israel. And I was told that this was anti-Semitic. So what can I say? I defended myself. I've said that these are not anti-Semitic. I'm not against any protected category. It's nothing to do with the Jews. I'm talking about Israel. But it hasn't helped, and I'm still under investigation, and I don't quite know how it will end. I'm not supposed to talk about it, but this is what it is in essence, that there are criticisms of Israel, and these are now called anti-Semitic. You see, and this is the problem, that Israel is in fact a protected category, not in the sense that we would understand it, but it is protected. As you, Lowkey, you yourself pointed out, it's a state of exception. It's something, we all need to think about. Why is that? What is this all about? Because that, of course, in the end, is when you have an entity which is regarded as being exceptional in every way. No wonder you have to be very careful what you say, what you do, So here we are. That's where I'm at. And I think we have a question.
Well, I'm sure I speak for all of us when saying that you are really, really important to all of us, and we hope to support you in any way that you need, Dr. Ghada. We must support each other. This is the only choice. So we've been given some questions here that Dania was intending to pass on from the audience, and what we have is the first question: what steps could the UK government take to rectify the ramifications of the Balfour Declaration? I'm going to put that first to Dr. Ghada, and then I'll pass that on to Leanne, if that's okay.
Well, the British government could disown the Balfour Declaration. It could say that this was a document passed a long time ago. What it led to was not something we approve of, and we are going to withdraw it. We are going to cancel it out. So that's one thing they could do. Now, the other thing that they could do would be to support the Palestinians overtly, support the Palestinians in their struggle, so on. Now, at the very least, there are, I know, organizations already in this country trying to pressure the British government to recognize Palestinian statehood. Now, that is, again, something that the government could do. From that to financial compensation, to all of this is a very big spectrum, but even the smallest thing they would do, I think, would be very meaningful. And I wanted to make that clear. My last statement, was said something like, we have to make them pay. It doesn't mean we're going to start attacking the British government. Of course not. We have to make it clear that neither the British government or any other agency can really create such a terrible tragedy and not do anything about it. It's not acceptable. That's not acceptable.
And if we pass the question on to Leanne.
Yeah, so I completely agree with Dr. Ghada, especially about accountability. And something that she mentioned was that we don't only want to hold them accountable for Balfour in 1917, but accountable to what has occurred since then. And definitely an apology is the least that they can do in this very moment. However, it will not compensate for the decades of Palestinian suffering that our families have endured. On top of that, simply recognizing our state is a very small step, and the least that they could do as well. But one of the main things I would say is that our UK government is complicit, and we are still, our government is still supplying arms sales to Israel, and that can easily stop. We need sanctions and we want accountability. And there are so many steps that the British government can do to start to rectify what has happened since then. And to be honest, it hurts that on this day where we Palestinians are mourning, we still have to urge the UK to right its wrongs 104 years later. But one thing that I will make clear is that we are never going to give up, and we are going to continue to ask them to right their wrongs as long as it will take. As Dr. Ghada said, anything will be meaningful at this stage, and we demand accountability.
If I can speak to that question, in the Arms Trade Treaty, which Britain is a signature of, the business secretary who stamps the exports that go from this country has the obligation to assess whether the arms sales may, and this is the direct quotation, may be used for violations of international humanitarian law. Now, what we saw was during Operation Cast Lead, David Miliband at that time as foreign minister said almost definitely British components were used in the operations against the Palestinian people that killed over 1,400 people. Of course, BAE Systems, the British company, makes components for the F-16 and also components for the F-35. Also, during the Great March of Return in Gaza, we saw the snipers, which were aimed at Palestinian knees, at really an unprecedented level, at quite a sadistic level. You had thousands of amputees just off the basis of that movement. And sniper components not only were sold to Israel by the British government before that, but they were also sold after that. So after the point when you've seen snipers used against unarmed people, you're still going ahead with that sale. So I think the very basic thing that the British government could, and we could pressure them to a point where at least temporarily there would be a freeze to the arms sales. Let's not forget that Nick Clegg, before he joined the coalition government, part of his platform had been ending arms sales to Israel. Even the Liberal Democrats at that point, this was an idea among them. And it's simple observance of the Arms Trade Treaty to which Britain is a signature. So I think that we could work on that for sure. In terms of the second question, we have, what is the reason behind the UK's long-standing support for Israel? And for the first answer, I would go to Leanne for that.
So regarding the UK's long-standing support for Israel, we obviously know that now it all started from the Balfour Declaration, and the Balfour Declaration was the main instigator for all the Jewish immigration to and settlement in Palestine, and gradually since then all the massacres and displacement of the Palestinian people in 1948. when Israel declared its independence. And on this day, when Israel celebrates its independence, and the British government, so as Dr. Ghada said in 2017, when Theresa May claimed that she was so proud of this day and they have a joyous celebration to mark it, it shows that the British government just do not care at all. They're backed by, obviously, Israel, backed by the UK government, the US government. And on top of this, till this day, the current Lord Balfour says that the Balfour Declaration was a humanitarian act, which does really frustrate me. And I'm sure it does to all the Palestinians, because this so-called humanitarian act has led to the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. And now the UK government still allow Israel's largest arms company to build weapons which are tested on Palestinians. So that's what I would say. But I'd love to hear more from Dr. Ghada on this.
Really important and a very puzzling question. There is no straightforward answer to it. There really isn't. You remember when I was in my talk just now, I talked about initially why did they pass the Balfour Declaration? Why did they nurture the Zionist project? And I said that there were really two sets of reasons, possible explanations. One is to do with the strategic importance of having an ally in a strategically important area. And the other, of course, is the sympathy felt on the part of non-Jews, let alone Jews, for the idea of a Jewish state. It remains a puzzle. Now, you could argue that various things enter into this. Having actually allowed Israel to come into being, it was difficult for any subsequent British government to disown the creation of a previous British government. So that would have been difficult to say this was a mistake, we shouldn't have done it, and this is a horrible little state. That's one thought that one has. Now, the other, of course, is to do with the United States. Britain, we know, is very close to the United States. It adopts the posture of the US on many issues, and this would be one of them. And if you think that, if you look at the challenge for Britain, do you go against US policy on this very sensitive issue? And if you do, do you do it for something like Palestine? And I suspect the answer would be no. Palestine is not important enough to anger or to incur the reaction from the United States. One must therefore, it's an open question, honestly. And I wish I knew to give you a direct answer. The whole issue of the Jewish lobby, which is very important in the United States, historically, the lobby in this country has not been as influential as it is in America, yet nevertheless, it has an influence. So that is also playing a role. I'm sorry if the answer isn't sort of clear-cut, but it's a very important question and one that we should continue to think about.
I think certainly when you look at the example of figures like Benjamin Disraeli or Lord Chamberlain, there was this historical precedent of a biblical connection to Zionism, but not as meaningful as it later became. For example, the longest strike in recorded human history was the Palestinian one in 1936. And to crush that strike, we have to remember that the British actually established some of the practices in Palestine which the Israeli occupying forces carry out today. So, for example, the destroying of homes for punitive measures, over 2,000 were destroyed during that period from 1936 to 1939. The using of Palestinians as human shields, minesweepers, this was established by the British occupying forces. Also, it was General Ord Wingate who came and organized the Zionist gangs into basically a skeletal structure of what could later be turned into the IDF. And in fact, Moshe Dayan said, "We are all Wingate's children." And it's noted that the Ord Wingate went out of his way to speak a form of Hebrew in his organizing of these Zionist groups in terms of their violence towards Palestinians. The late 30s then led to an interesting period where, let's not forget that from both sides of the Zionist movement, the Ben-Gurion side and the Vladimir Jabotinsky side, both of them had been trained by the British military in World War I. And in addition to that, they were in the very same, the Jewish Legion, which was a part of the British military in World War I, that was also where Herbert Samuel, the first British High Commissioner of the British Mandate, his own son, also fought in that legion with these other two leaders of the Zionist movement later on. Of course, Jabotinsky at that point was sentenced to something like 15 years in prison by the British military authorities, but later released after less than a year, if I remember correctly. But his groups, the groups linked to him later, in fact, wanted to assassinate Ernest Bevin, the foreign minister of Britain. They attempted to bomb what was the colonial office then, but became the foreign office in London. And were kidnapping British soldiers, killing them and booby trapping their bodies. However, the straight line of cooperation remained even at points where there were elements of the Zionist movement fighting the British occupying forces, mainly the Jabotinsky influence side, but the Ben-Gurion side was still working, the Palmach was working very, very closely with the British throughout the entire process. In terms of today and where we are, we also have to remember, though, that if it wasn't for Harold Wilson supplying Israel with around 500 Centurion tanks, the occupation in 1967 couldn't have happened. The Suez War revealed massive collaboration between the British and Israelis. And in fact, in 1973, the British Atomic Energy Authority shared vital information with the Israelis. Was that useful in the developing of nuclear weapons for Israel? A major question, which has, of course, not been asked because the Israelis don't even admit to having nuclear weapons, but we know that they do in the settlement of Dimona. But today, where we find ourselves is a situation where a third of the British cabinet, including Boris Johnson himself, have not only been funded by either Israel or pro-Israel lobby groups. You even have Michael Gove, who is constantly jockeying to replace Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, directly being funded by AIPAC to visit the United States and have meetings with the organization. We have reached a really unprecedented level of cooperation in military and intelligence between the British government and Israel. The direction that has gone in has not ceased across these years. That's why, in my opinion, our only option is, on one side, lobbying exists and can have some worth. I do believe that community enforced BDS, movement of people, shutting down of factories, making the schools not a place where organizations like One Voice or Solutions Not Sides can clearly operate when they have this level of connection to Israeli intelligence and organizations involved in the ethnic cleansing and the colonization of Palestine, is understanding the function of organizations like Forward Thinking. This is essentially British military intelligence using British taxpayer money to neutralize Muslim organizations and astroturf a form of Muslim Zionism, essentially. And I think it's really important that we cultivate a criticality when thinking about some of these organizations who seem very, very keen to engage us on the Palestinian question. Before we wrap up, those are, of course, my views and not representative of the Palestinian Return Center. Of course, before we wrap up, it would be great to take a final word from both Leanne and Ghada, if you have anything you would like to say before we finish.
Well, let me just I'd like to just comment on what you said about the situation between this country and Israel. You see, the problem is it doesn't actually provide the answer to our questioner. You can talk about and you can detail the way that Britain is entangled in Israel and the various aspects and ways in which there is a relationship, but it doesn't answer the question of why. What is there about Israel that is so important? And I tell you, this is a really good question because I'm probably taking a lot, but I really want to leave people with this thought. I don't have the answer, which is that if Israel is indeed useful in various senses, surveillance, equipment, strategic position, all of the various things you can think of. If it's that important, if it's important, fine, you can make it, you can work with it, you can give it favorable things. You don't need to go to this degree of indulgence. That, for me, is a very strange thing about this. If what you want is what, country A wants something that country B provides, country A will do various things in order to buy those things or get it. It doesn't need to put country B into this sacred cow category. This is what I find very strange about the support for Israel. It's excessive. You don't need to pay that much in order to get what you want from Israel. I leave our listeners with that thought. It puzzles me, and if anybody has an answer, let me know.
Thank you. Leanne, do you have a message to leave us with?
Yeah, so I just want to add on a bit about something that Lowkey actually mentioned, and it's about the current systematic targeting of human rights defenders by Israel and its criminalization of these 6 vital Palestinian civil society organizations. And this is something that we need to pressure the UK to urgently take action on. There is also going to be a student day of action for Palestine on the 1st of December, where we students will take action and will be standing with Palestinians under attack, including the 6 recently criminalized civil society organizations and Palestinian students resisting apartheid. There is so much that we can do. I know that a common question that always comes up is, okay, I'm watching this now, so what can I do for Palestine? So I'm going to leave you all on this note, which is, for now, keep posting on social media, keep Palestine viral, keep amplifying Palestinian voices, boycott Israeli products, target the companies complicit in these human rights violations. Carry on calling on your representatives to speak up and act now. Continue lobbying, support divestment campaigns across all UK campuses. And if you are a university student watching this, then join your Palestine Society. And if there ain't one, create one. Make sure you organize, keep pushing. And all we want as Palestinians is honestly just keep the conversation going, because our solidarity movement is not a trend. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for participating in this discussion. Thank you to Dania, who opened us up, and thank you to the Palestinian Return Center. Let's keep struggling. Let's keep pushing forward.